Wow. I hope that this morning's information, the data, the ability in order to uh, see the details that the Center for Houston's Future has put together on Houston and as well as our region was informative and hopefully and insightful and inciting. And I think as we continue through this weekend and beyond, the question will be, what do you want to do with that information? And how do we, is that the only information that we need? Do we need more? And what do we want to do with it? But I have the privilege today to introduce our next speaker. When we talk about creative placemaking, Ann Markison is the name that comes up. She has helped to define the ideas and the theories and put that out into the larger public. And Anne is also one of the most distinguished people I have ever met. I think that her accolades from the different, if you look at her bio, she not only has her bachelor's degree from Georgetown and her PhD in economics from Michigan State University, she's also served in the faculties of Minnesota, Rutgers, Northwestern, Cal Berkeley, and Colorado. Then she also has the UK Fulbright Distinguished Chair, Glasgow School of Art, and the Professor at Large at Cornell University School of Art, Architecture, and Planning. She works with more universities than, well, cities in the nation. But when we talk about data and its interpretation and its application, I think Anne has been incredible in the ways of working and as an ally, and also to help the arts community think beyond itself and to think about what the possibilities are. And I hope that you find her remarks and her data interesting and informative and inciting. Thank you. Ann Markison.
Hi, thanks. It's so great to be here. Thank you for hanging out on a Saturday afternoon. And I was really delighted to be invited, and I learned so much today, and I'm going to give some feedback to the group this morning about some more things they could do with their data, et cetera. So, and some new data they could. I started my work about 12 years ago. I switched from working on the military-industrial complex to working on the arts, and I started with artists because I really teach economic development, and I wanted to emphasize that it's time to stop throwing money at companies and trying to get them to come from one place to another. We should really think about jobs in terms of occupations and human capital and, growing our own, et cetera. So I looked around for an occupation to study. I had just moved back to my home city of Minneapolis, St. Paul, and I saw that artists had just blossomed there since I had left 35 years before, and I decided to study artists, and I immediately felt like this was very self-indulgent because it was so much more fun than talking to defense contractors. So I'm just going to quickly share a little bit of data with you that will kind of support some of the things you saw this morning. First of all, I want to really point out that artists have very, very high levels of self-employment. These data are from the 2000 census, but it would not be that much different now. So if you include people who do their art form as a second job, 65% of artists, 57% of visual artists, 41% of musicians, and 36% of performing artists are self-employed. And that compares with 8% of all US workers at that period of time. So the conditions under which artists work are very, very different, and we have to really remember that all the time. I also did some really interesting work, which really puts Houston in another light and shows another challenge. Again, this is from the 2000 census, and unfortunately we don't have this question in the American Community Survey, which replaced the long form of the census, which is, where did you live 5 years before? So I computed net migration rates for the top 30 metropolitan areas in the U.S., and Houston was at the very bottom. So what these numbers show is that between 1995 and 2000, and again, that was a while back, that altogether there were almost 10,000 artists, and these are people who said that this was their major art form in answering the census. But in that period of time, 2,000 artists had moved into Houston, and more than 5,000 artists had left. So that was the highest net rate of net migration. You can see who's at the top: Los Angeles and New York, but also some other fast-growing places like Phoenix and Dallas and so on. So that's one of the challenges. Here's a little bit different view, which came from a paper by Carl Grodak and Michael Seaman at University of Texas, Arlington. They took the American Community Survey data and looked at what happened over the recent recession. And this is very good news for Houston, because while it shows that Houston is below the average for all of these cities in terms of the density of artists in your workforce, and that has been persistent over time, it is one of the farther out this way, the more artists you added during this period of time, the cultural sector employment growth. And so Houston was one of the very fastest growing. In other words, you added artists during the Great Recession, whereas many other places lost them. I would point out that my city, Minneapolis-St. Paul, actually added more artists during the period than any of these other 30 metro areas. And I was disappointed that these places like Seattle, Minneapolis, and Washington, D.C. were not included in the comparison in the work that we saw this morning. I was just curious why they weren't, because I think they are competitor cities to you. They are options for people where to move. I did a very wonderful study in California where I probed through a large survey how artists in the LA and Bay areas combined working across commercial, nonprofit, and community sectors. And I really recommend it to you. I can't really go into it today, but I want to also underscore this about artists. So many artists are working not just in the nonprofit sector. So the figures you saw this morning on artists, actually what they were artists who were employed, and they did include people working in the commercial sector, but they didn't include unemployed people. But many, many artists are working across sectors, and some of them really love doing it, and I recommend this study. And it has lots of profiles of different kinds of artists in it that tells their stories. I wanted to show these numbers to underscore what I said this morning, because a lot of you were very interested in different kinds of organizations. And the NCCS data that was used this morning, you can break out into budget size categories and into different kind of disciplinary categories. And the main thing I really want to say about it is that if you don't include the organizations under $25,000 in annual budgets, which a lot of them, for instance, in Santa Ana, California, there's an organization of teachers that runs a whole writing program for kids that they do in the summer. They do it for free. They don't pay themselves. They run on a budget of $5,000 a year, but they make a big difference. And they produce, and their kids go off to competitions and so on and so on. But this is why if you just look at budget or expenditure or revenue as a way of a marker for a size of organization, you're not really sizing the organization right. So it turned out that actually over 50% of arts organizations in California in 2008 or 2010, I guess, were actually under $25,000 in size. The other thing we did was really break it out by these. You can break this out by visual arts, film, media, broadcasting, and publishing. This is just nonprofits, because this is the nonprofit day. Music, arts and cultural support, that would include professional associations and so on. Performing arts, humanities, legacy, and ethnic folk arts and multidisciplinary. And again, you can really see that if you don't include the small ones, like look at these two groups here. More than 20% of all arts organizations are in those categories, but only if you include the ones under $25,000 in annual revenue and expenditure. And finally, I just wanted to underscore this other point that I made as well. This I learned from using the Cultural Data Project data, which I think is very problematic in a lot of ways, but there are some things it asks that we don't have any other way, and one is, how many volunteers do you have? And then we could compute volunteers to paid staff ratios. And here you can see huge differences. So actually, our estimate for under $25,000 was 31 volunteers to every paid person. And for really big organizations, like less than 1 volunteer to every person in the organization. So again, we asked this, we did interviews of 40 small ethnic and immigrant arts organizations in California, some of which are profiled in our study. And we asked them, if you paid the people who were doing the work, what would your annual budget be? People say, oh, $300,000, So it gave us a real sense for how important these small organizations are and, how that's obscured by the fact that they rely on a lot of volunteer labor. I'm going to really use this metric here, which is reproduced in our creative economy, or our creative placemaking study, but actually it comes from the New England Creative Economy Project from Doug DiNatale and Greg Wassel. And think about 3 analytical entry points to thinking about our cultural ecologies. One of them is by studying people, and that's what I started doing. I started studying artists. But people also includes managers, individual managers. I did a study in California of next generation arts leaders through a survey, and that was a fascinating thing to do. And it also includes patrons and all kinds of other people, teachers. There are a lot of entry points through looking at workers, the people who do the work. There are a lot of entry points through business organizations. If people aren't getting my little thing here, but anyway, through all kinds of organizations that are involved in the arts. Many of your organizations that you're talking here, many cultural industry organizations. So a lot of the cultural sector, especially in things like film, media, print, and so on, are actually for-profit organizations, not just nonprofit ones, and also public sector organizations, or things like the Arts Alliance. All of those are organizations, and they play a role. And then there's the place role. I've been teaching in urban and regional planning almost all of my career, which I love. And so my work has always been grounded in place. And the intersection of these is what we've really been talking about in this conference, and it's what I'm really most interested in my work. And I'm going to mainly be talking about creative placemaking for the rest of my time, and creative placemaking happens in this nexus of all 3. Okay, I'm sorry I have to keep looking, but my computer isn't advancing the same way, so I have to see what's up there. I wanted to quickly tell the story how I came to do this study, which is quite amazing. Oops, I want to skip those. So in 2009, Rocco Landesman, who's a Broadway producer, was invited by President Obama to be his new chair of the National Endowment for the Arts. And Rocco Landesman is a Broadway producer. He owns 4 theaters on Broadway. And he's brought some of the edgiest work to Broadway, like Angels in America. He's a really extraordinary person. He chose as his deputy director Joan Shigekawa, who had been the arts program director at the Rockefeller Foundation for a long time and had really funded some of the most interesting community-based work in arts and culture in the country. One thing I'd like to point out about these 2 people, even though they were both at the top of their game in New York City, they did not know each other before they paired up to do this job in Washington. So in the fall of 2009, Joan called me up and she said, I'd like you to come to Washington and have dinner with Rocco and I. And I'm kind of like, me? You want me to come and have dinner with you? So I did. They wanted to pitch a project to me, and they wanted me to write basically a white paper for their new Our Town initiative, and it was Joan's idea to call it creative placemaking. So I was really thrilled to be asked to do it, and I said I would do it, and then they explained why they wanted to do it and what the framework was. So when Rocco Landesman came to Washington and looked at his budget, he wept. It was so small. I forget what it is. It's like a few $100 million a year. And he immediately began to do 2 things. He looked across Washington at all the big, rich agencies like housing and urban development, transportation, environmental protection, defense, labor, and so on. And he began calling on the secretaries of those different departments and saying, arts and culture could really help you with your mission. And let me give you some examples how. And that's how we've gotten these things like now. In fact, I just had a wonderful conversation with one of you about the light rail, stations being built here. That's now the Department of Transportation will pay for artists to design stations and to do it in consultation with the communities in which the stations are located. That's a huge achievement. So The other thing Rocco Landesman did was to acknowledge that he had never been out of Manhattan and that he should go around and see the rest of the United States. And he did a very, very smart thing. You know, he would call up the arts people in Chicago and he'd say, come with me, we're going to go see the mayor. And he'd bring out the journalists, because he was the head of the NEA. They would go to see the mayor, and they would explain to the mayor what arts do for their city. And this, of course, he made one big gaffe right away. In Chicago, he said, oh, of course, this is Chicago. You have the Art Institute and the Lyric Opera. You're not like Peoria. And the people in Peoria said, what? They called him up. They said, what? You think we have no arts and culture? You have to come down here right away. So he did. And he spent about 1 week out of every month for the first couple of years that he was NEA chair doing this, going around, meeting people, and urging people in the arts community to make their case to the mayor, to other politicians, to other groups in their communities. And these idea of crossing mission areas and organizing and walking out of the doors of your organization and making claims about your contribution to a place are at the heart of the Our Town initiative that Rocco Landesman started and built on an early initiative that had been there before. And also Rocco Landesman did all of the backdoor work to really create Art Place, which was a consortium of the largest funders in the United States to do a very similar project of putting money into a competitive pot where people could propose projects from around the country. I want to also say that the NEA program had one really remarkable feature, I thought, which underscored this idea of, partnering and walking out your front door, which is that every proposal to the Our Town program has to involve two partners. One has to be a public sector partner, and one has to be a nonprofit partner, and one of them has to be an arts organization. So you can have a cultural affairs department of a city government teaming up with a healthcare nonprofit, or you can have an arts nonprofit teaming up with the Department of Transportation or Public Works. So it's a very, very interesting program, and I think it has prompted a different way of seeing how arts organizations can work in place that has really, worked across the United States to encourage lots of people to do this. We said we would write this piece, my colleague Ann Gadwa Nicodemus and I, together, but we had to do some research. We couldn't just write a piece about creative placemaking. We had to really find successful cases of it. And they said, okay, but you only have 5 months and you only have really this kind of modest amount of money. So we said, okay, we made a plan. We said we're going to do it by phone. We're going to spend, months on the phone talking to people all over the U.S., and we're going to identify basically completed creative placemaking projects that have these features that you're imagining for your program. And so I'm just going to give you one, case study of one of these example. There are 15 other ones profiled in our creative placemaking study, which you can get off my website or Ann's or the NEA's, but they didn't put the executive summary and the full report together, so you have to get them both. This was the definition that we worked out with Joan, who was a wonderful client, by the way, that creative placemaking happens when partners from public, private, nonprofit, and community sectors, or at least two of those, strategically shape the physical and social character of a neighborhood, town, reservation, city, or region around arts and cultural activities. I want to really underscore that from beginning we all agreed that this wasn't about using arts as an instrument for something else. It was about putting arts and culture at the core. And I'm so proud to say that the NEA's rubric on its website for the Our Town thing says, with arts and culture at its core. These are some of the outcomes that we articulate in our study: animating public and private spaces. And animating, you know what that means, people doing artwork and performing, etc. Rejuvenating streets and structures, improving local business viability and public safety, bringing diverse people together to celebrate, inspire, and be inspired, again, with arts and culture at its core. I would rewrite these somewhat now after, 5 years, however long it's been. And one of the things that we really found striking was that our own anticipation of what we found was quite different than what we actually found. And one of them was something that Joan was very struck by and called me up one day. She said, I can't believe, as we started to turn in these case studies, oh, and by the way, she said, it's fine if you do case studies, but you have to do every kind of place. You have to do older industrial cities and new suburban cities. You have to do small towns. You have to do every different kinds of art discipline and so on and so forth. So it was kind of a stretch, but we built a huge roster of potential cases and worked from there. But one of the things was that in every case that we studied, there was generally one person who initiated it, one person with the vision and the drive to really make it happen. I'm going to show you a couple examples. And Joan called me up and said, I can't believe how many of these people are artists. I said, yeah, that was really a surprise to us too. But it's really true. They weren't all artists, but it was surprising how often one artist really made something happen, started it. All of them also were tailored to distinctive features of place. So this was very fascinating. It wasn't like, a medium-sized town saying, oh, they have a performing arts center, we need one. No, they all built around some feature of their culture or their place or their legacy environment they had that they could really, put them on the map, so to speak. Not really for tourism or anything, but just really to build a sense of community and underscore that through an artistic lens. Just think about, country music in Nashville, and things like that. That kind of an idea. And again, I'll show you some of those. All of them had to mobilize public will, which meant getting at least the mayor or one member of the city council to be in favor of your, what you were doing and give you a little bit of money. And also just to get the general public excited about it in some way. All of them had to attract public sector buy-in. I think that goes without saying. Bank financing, developers in some case to redo buildings and so on. All of them had to garner the support of local arts and cultural leaders. And you would think that that would be a no-brainer, but actually a lot of existing arts philanthropies, et cetera, were very committed to their existing set of arts organizations. They really weren't interested in this new kind of thing, even if it was an established organization that was participating in it. And sometimes they were the last people to really get on board. And finally, they had to build partnerships across sectors, as I've spoken about, transportation or housing or community development or healthcare, across, those are mission areas, across sectors, commercial, nonprofit, public sector, community, and levels of government. I'm going to really quickly show you one case from Cleveland, Ohio, because in a way it's the best documented case that we have, and I won't even go through all the funding issues, but this is Detroit Shoreway, which is the main arterial on the west side of Cleveland going towards Detroit. This is a working class community, auto industry and steel jobs. It was quite prosperous in the 30s. You can see the cars here in the streets, and this was the Capitol Film Theater, which by the 1990s looked like this. Oops, where's it? Looked like this. Notice the police cars in the foreground. This young man in the middle, who was a musician, decided he wanted to reopen this Capitol Film Theater and restore it. He bought the building, and he got his friends to help him. And for the first 7 years, he could just only keep the roof on. He needed partners. He realized nobody was going to give him money to redo this building. He realized that there was a defunct public theater. There was an existing public theater company, but their space across the street was also shuttered, but it could be restored. And there was a youth theater performing out of the upstairs of a church. He formed a coalition of these 3 theater groups, and then they said, we're going to create a Gordon Square theater district. And then they went out and looked for partners. What they really needed was somebody who knew something about development. They found a community development corporation that had been building low-income housing for 40 years quite successfully in their neighborhood, and they were really interested. So together, this was the partnership that they formed. They had a really hard time kind of getting going, and they decided that what they really needed to do was have a marker, which was to develop a streetscape. And to make a long story short, they did that. So this is what the streetscape looks like today. Artists designed. And their first big project then was just getting the money together for the streetscape. And this is, I think, a really interesting table that shows you the bits of money they had to get together and where they got it from. The first ones are just small amounts of money from LISC and from their city council member, a district city council member, got them a little community development block money to do the feasibility study for the streetscape. And then it took them another 3 years to actually build the streetscape and get the money together, mostly public sector money. And then the theater renovations themselves, which were pricier, took them another few years to do. And mostly, again, lots of different layers of government money from. And only after that did the big foundations, the Gunn and the Cleveland Foundation, support them, because they were committed to the big arts institutions on the east side of Cleveland, and they were very resistant for the first 5 years to really chip in. Also, lots of philanthropic contributions and so on. And so this is what it looks like today, the Capitol Film Theater, the Youth Theater performing on the proscenium stage of the Capitol Film Theater because their theater hadn't been built yet, the Cleveland Public Theater, and their youth summer theater group performing. So this has really been a major, major placemaking success. And we were able to really document the length of time it took. And one of the sort of sobering things about it is that these organizations told me that they each had to put in about a third of their time for about 3 years in the beginning of it to really make it work. So, and that's a big challenge because you've got your own programming challenges and everything else, but it's really a wonderful story. I'm going to shift really quickly here and just give you some examples of how artists have been amazing placemakers, some of them from our study, some of them not. This is Marcus Shelby. He is a bassist, a jazz bassist, and he has the Marcus Shelby Jazz Orchestra in San Francisco. And his big innovation was to create a for-profit space called Cafe Royale in downtown San Francisco or near downtown San Francisco. And what made it exceptional is that he created space in the basement for visual art and music studios for people to practice and rehearse and do their work. And every Wednesday night in the winter, he runs a free, open to anybody in the community session on the history of jazz. So one night he might take, how blues, underpins jazz and do that and bring his combo, and he's got a combo, and perform it and work with people together around that. So he's done it in a very different way, creative place, and creating this kind of space where the community living around there can really convene and giving something back to them for free. And of course, they make their money from the food and the alcohol, etc. He also, I would say, has done some amazing commissions. He did an incredible series of pieces together, forming an oratorio about Port Chicago, which was the largest, continental disaster in World War II, where 300 African-American sailors, they were in the Navy, were, blown up in an ammunition thing. And then when the rest of the, sailors protested, they were, dishonorably discharged from the U.S. Navy. And this oratorio, which he took around to all these communities, helped to get these men, the ones that were still living, reinstated and what they were due in terms of retirement and pay back to them. So really quite an amazing. This is Judy Baca. I won't really say too much about her, but she is a Latina visual artist in the LA area. And before almost anybody else was doing this, she created these amazing murals and involved a lot of other people. There's one big one that's, on the way out into the San Fernando Valley from LA, and really explored this form as a way of, producing in space the history, the vibrancy of contemporary and past Latino cultures. She's now a professor at UCLA. Here's another example of mural arts. This woman, Jane Golden, in Philadelphia, 30 years ago, approached the mayor of Philadelphia and said, you've got a lot of really downtrodden buildings. You've got a lot of youth violence and unemployment. How about if we started a mural arts program where I and others would teach young people and prisoners how to, paint and do art, and do good art, and put it on buildings, in this all around Philadelphia. And the remarkable thing is the mayor at the time said, okay, and we'll fund it right out of our general fund budget. Right out of my office, I'll run this program. And it's been very durable, and it's made a huge difference to many neighborhoods in Philadelphia, but also to many individuals. Part of the idea was to encourage young people to become artists, to give people who had, were first-time offenders another opportunity in life, and so on. So many of Philadelphia's neighborhoods, this is still an ongoing program, have been enlivened in this way, and I really love this picture of the garbage trucks that this program, just think of the opportunities that you have really to fill space, urban space, with beautiful things. This can happen in very small towns as well, and this is one of my favorite stories, which is in our creative placemaking one, so is Jane Golden's story. This is George Marks, an established visual artist in Louisiana, who went back home to his small town in Arnoldville because his father was dying, to take care of his father, and he realized that his community had just become full of crack houses and that it was like really in sad state. So he made a commitment to staying there. He had gallery representation. He, didn't have to be there. And he started looking around for something to do or create. He created this New News Cafe, which a couple of years later burned down, which was a place where he began to really celebrate visual art and music. And pretty soon he really began to think deeply about the fact that his area is full of Cajun music, which comes, from France via Arcadian Canada and down, but also Creole music. Lots of people there have come from the West Indies. And one amazing common thing is that they speak French. A lot of them still speak French. So he started the idea of French language tables, and a wonderful little gray-haired lady who I had the opportunity to spend some time with when I went there to visit said to me, the very first night, somebody from the Cajun community started to correct the pronunciation of somebody from the Creole community, and I said, no, no, no. Any kind of French pronunciation is welcome at this table. And so they sort of managed to really preserve that. They attracted the attention of the French attaché, who has, come and helped them, funded them, taken a bunch of them to Brittany to see what they're doing in that part of France, which has a kind of very similar challenge in terms of employment and development. And now they're going to convert their shuttered 60s era, small town hospital into a French language immersion school. So this is an amazing story of the celebration of visual art and music and French language in a very small town, and what one artist started, but also who's brilliant at how to incorporate and bring other people in, and how to work with the very resistant city fathers over a long period of time. These are some of the performers in the various music things they do. There's a fiddler that's moved there, a Creole musician. When we weren't there, they were having a parade one night. Uh-oh. Why is it not? Oh, there it is. Oh, I went, wait. Oh, did they both not? Oh, because I have somebody else doing it for me over there. Okay. All right, now I'm going to move to sort of a really different kind of place. I'm going to talk about a few arts organizations that I think have done really, really interesting things about Create Placing. Do people know what this is? Okay, this is the Disney Center run by the LA Music Center and housing the Philharmonic. I believe this is a poster of Dudamel. I can't really quite see it. So about 12 years ago, they hired Josephine Ramirez to direct an active arts program. It was really her idea. And the idea was to help Los Angelinos get in touch again with their own artistic creativity, with music, with dance. They created a whole program called Get Your Chops Back to pick up your high school instrument and play it with other people. It was just there's a group called Highfalutin that came out of it that performs at weddings and cafes. But one of their biggest challenges is where they are. So it is, still, like canyons in downtown LA when it's not the work day. And even then, it's just very, very, sort of people-unfriendly place. And one of the major achievements of the Active Arts program, which is still going on, is Dance Downtown. And I know now other places do it. We even do it in St. Paul in the summer. But I think this was really the first place they did it. So Josephine's idea was this. Every Friday night from April to October, there would be dancing in the plaza outside the LA Music Center. And it wasn't about getting butts into the seat in the Music Center. And there was no effort to do that or track anybody and see if they came back or anything else. It was about music and dance. And she told me this funny story that she, when she started, she called the production people and said, okay, I'm going to need musicians. And, and they said, okay, we'll build a stage and put the musicians there and lights. She said, no, it's not about the musicians. It's about the dancing and the music. So the musicians will be over there with little lights over their music, and we will build a temporary stage, but it'll just be for the person teaching the dance form that night. And after 45 minutes, we'll take that down, and people will just be dancing, and this is what it looks like. Huge numbers of people. This has been amazingly popular. Large numbers of Latino families come 2 hours ahead of time and camp out on the picnic tables and bring their food out and get ready. They don't care if it's the polka night or the waltz and ballroom dance night or salsa night. And this has been just an amazing celebratory thing. And part of it is the teaching of the dance as well. By the way, in the survey of public participation in the arts, the art form people say they most would like to do themselves and at home, et cetera, is dance. And I'm also happy to say that the survey is moving towards incorporating more and more do-it-yourself art in the survey, and it's going to paint a whole different picture of participation in the United States when we get that. They have a public practice program. So here's a guy practicing the guitar in public, and he's got a little sign that explains who he is and why he's there. They also have sing-alongs. This is one of Janet Jackson with a whole bunch of other people. I almost went one night and sang Christmas carols where we would hand out music to people in the streets of downtown LA and so on and so forth. So another really interesting example, and again, inspired by this long-term idea that if people are experiencing making music and doing movement themselves, it means they're much more likely to really understand who's really good at it. And much more apt to want to go and see somebody who's really good at dance or really good at music perform it. So that's the basic idea of Larry Gross in his wonderful book, Art and Artists on the Margins, where he demonstrates that in primitive societies, so-called primitive societies, everybody learns to dance and play a musical instrument and sing, and it doesn't mean that they don't know who's really good at it, and they give those people a place of honor. But in our society, we've taken a very different route. There are other kinds of organizations I won't have time to talk about now. One of them are artist centers, and I've heard about a couple of them that you have in Houston. I did a documentation of many of these in the Twin Cities and the rest of Minnesota, which were membership organizations with dedicated space, either disciplinary or neighborhood-oriented, started by artists, for artists, but open to anybody for membership at a modest rate, and were a place where amateurs and professionals could gather, support each other, share equipment, mentor each other, and so on. I will tell you about one of them, Intermedia Arts, because it's just so extraordinary. It started as UC Video, a bunch of professors and students taking video in the 70s out to help communities. They moved to a neighborhood which had a high density of artists. That's how they chose it. They looked at the zip code. Oh, there are more artists here than anywhere else. But shortly they figured out that they were in a heavily immigrant neighborhood in Minneapolis, and that they should really change their strategy entirely. And what they started to do was a huge project, really working with immigrant artists. So they would find the artists in the various immigrant groups and work with them to become artists again. Like this man from Chad here was a famous artist in Chad, but was a political refugee, helped him reconnect with his artwork, and then helped address the needs of his community through his art. And this is a woman from Russia. You can't see these very, this is a bad boy from LA who moved to the Twin Cities and, got art and got mentored and now does the same thing for other young people. And they also have this annual art car parade, which is another way of walking out your doors. This organization has been very, very active in its neighborhood association, in its business association, to try to stabilize and keep diverse its particular neighborhood, which is possibly under gentrification. So on. I want to also point out that there's a lot of creative placemaking that we don't see because it's very particular to certain communities. This is actually a picture taken 12 miles down the road from where I live in northern Minnesota. It's from the Fond du Lac Indian Reservation. That reservation has 3 different powwow grounds, and these powwow celebrations are full of music and art, the amazing costumes, the beadwork that people are wearing. And one of the amazing things about them is just how intergenerational and participatory it really is. So and these happen many times during the year. You can go to a powwow almost every week in the summer, if not on this reservation, on one of the other ones. So this is a way that Native Americans have created, beautiful cultural spaces for themselves, and then share it with each other. This is a very quick little insight into another kind of underground form of cultural organization. This is an organization that wasn't even really a nonprofit until recently. It's called El Centro Cultural. It's in Santa Ana, California, and it was put together by immigrants from Veracruz, Mexico, mostly really recent immigrants, to keep the traditions of haraca and music alive in their community, and to teach bilingual language, and to use their artwork in a constant battle they have with the government of Santa Ana, which is always trying to gentrify them out of where they are. They're in their 6th rented space. And they have a very democratic decision-making structure where everybody participates and everybody's art form is okay. So grandmothers are knitting, and their grandsons who are hip-hop artists are expected to support their knitting and vice versa. It's a very, very interesting organization. And here's just another example. This is a group, Hanuri, from Los Angeles, that we interviewed in our project that Maria and I and others did in California to showcase how artists use their traditional cultural art forms and instruments, in this case, in a political protest in favor of immigrant rights. And they're using the streets as their place for that creative placemaking. I want to finish with how many more minutes? I have 20 minutes left? Oh, that's so great. We'll have a lot of time to talk. Okay. I wanted to show you a couple of really amazing artists who are actually working for city governments, and not just as doing the public art, but in a very rich and inspired way. Because I think this is another way to go, and I think we should be demanding that city governments do that. So this man here, Marcus Young, is a, what does he call himself? A conceptual and behavioral artist. He has an amazing background. He was born in Hong Kong. He grew up in Iowa. He went to Carleton and did a music degree, and then he went to University of Minnesota and did a theater degree. And I don't know how he got this job in this, but he got the mayor of St. Paul to, agree to pay him a salary to come in and be an artist in residence. Originally, it was going to be just like 1 year. And the mayor said to him, "What department would you like your desk located in?" And he said, "Public Works." So Public Works, that's really interesting, since there's no cultural affairs department in St. Paul. So, and what he has done there is really quite amazing. I'm just going to read you a little bit from his website, in his own words, really, of what he says about himself. So he offers his desire to belong to a place accumulated after decades of living at a distance and wandering across artistic disciplines. Marcus offers his deep desire to belong to a place accumulated after decades. Oh, I read that. I must have put that in there twice. So one of his first projects was to do everyday poems for sidewalks, and by which he turned the city into a book by reimagining St. Paul's annual sidewalk maintenance program. So working with Public Works, and he has to get all these engineers to agree that they should spend money to help artists put their poetry on sidewalks. Here's just one example. I'll read it to you. The woman's name is Caitlin Hibbard. And this is the space it's in. You can't see it on the sidewalk, but it says, "Advice for gardeners: accept brevity, celebrate decay, emancipate failed growth, hope it'll just keep living, mulch near odd places, quit raking, sleep, tend unlimited variegated words, Xerox your zucchini." So there are just so many examples of this all over St. Paul, and people really have enjoyed participating in that. He also does these amazing performances, which consist of kind of Buddhist-like walking. So here he is up here just doing, this walking, where he just walks. In this case, it was raining, so he's walking with an umbrella over. He's just walking slowly in kind of meditative way. And here he's also walking in another place. And here is what he says about this work. His practice attends to the collective experience of our inner, natural, and civic lives, and has included works involving slow walking and smiling, wishing and flying kites, drawing lines miles long, dancing in public, and community gift giving. So this has been so successful that just last month, the city of St. Paul announced they were adding 2 more artists in residence. It's just really kind of an amazing thing. We do have an exceptional mayor of St. Paul, and he really, I think, does understand how living in the shadow of Minneapolis, that, arts and culture is one of his major tools that is going to really help make what is a really vibrant, residential community into a more successful place. The other, interestingly enough, is the city of Minneapolis. So for years, I was saying to the mayor of Minneapolis, who just left office, can't you do something more for the arts? We had like 1 part-time person in our public art department. We're a big city. And he just said to me, "We're already doing really well in arts and culture. We don't need anybody more." So, but now that changed. A couple of years ago, he hired this amazing woman, Gulgun Kayim, and put her right in his office to kind of protect her from all the crossfire in city government, to be the director of arts, culture, and creative economy in Minneapolis. She is an amazing artist herself, and I'll show you just a little bit of her work. She is a Cypriot immigrant, and a lot of her earlier work was an exploration of the violence she experienced as a child in Cyprus between the Greeks and the Turks. And this particular piece, and I don't know if these are, I think these are different visions of it. Self-Portrait is an 8-character, site-specific performance installation about memory and identity. Minding her own history as a Turkish Cypriot forced to immigrant to the United Kingdom due to violence at home, Kayim draws on interviews with members of the Greek and Turkish Cypriot diaspora in creating this piece. Self-Portrait is the third in a series of installations by Kayim that are both explicitly formal in the way they respond to their location and imbued with a deep sense of history, political currency, and dislocation. This is a really amazing person. Actually, she's doing this job because she has kids and she needs money. Even though she was a creative capital fundee, was funded for 3 years, it's still been so hard for her to make a living doing her kind of work that she took this job with city government. She's doing an amazing job with it. And this is just an example of a piece of work she did we have a new Northern Spark Festival. It's a one-night festival that goes from 6 o'clock at night to 6 o'clock the next morning. And all these different artists are invited to come and do these, site-specific performances all over the city. So this is one that she did. And hers went from 8:55 in the evening to 5:28 in the morning. She did it with 2 other collaborators. It was called Please Remain Seated. They had 15 buses that Northern Spark had, to take people to all these different sites. So these were audio performances tailored for the 15 festival buses and their drivers along the routes of Northern Spark, giving riders a glimpse into the inner life of driving and being driven as they navigate the city. Please Remain Seated explored the forgotten spaces of a system of public transit and the dynamics within a system of public service. So you'd get on the bus, and then you would be watching this video of, people being on this bus at other times, who they were, where they were going, and so on and so forth. Really brilliant. So that's just some other ideas for you. I'm trying to sort of weave a picture here of the incredible role of artists, of different kinds of organizations, and what they've done. You can also see a lot of other different kinds of organizations in our case studies in creative placemaking. I also just wanted to say that one of the best things that's really looked carefully at the results of funding small, ethnically specific and immigrant organizations is this report by Roberto Bedoya, who's the executive director of the Tucson Pima Arts Council, where he has really gone out of his way to fund Native American and Latino and other organizations in his region, and they just did this wonderful study of the outcomes. And I think those of you really interested in diversity in Houston could get a lot of great ideas from seeing the different kinds of things that they funded and their evaluation of them. So finally, I would just say, the creative placemaking is really hard to do. And these are the challenges that we found in talking to the people that had done it in all these different communities. So the first is really forging and sustaining partnerships. I don't think I have to say much about that to people in this room. You probably are all doing that in different ways. It takes time. It takes energy. It takes sensitivity to your partner's priorities, which are going to be different than yours, especially if they're in a different mission area or if they're a different kind of organization. You have to be careful not to have too many partners, and you have to also you have to bond. You have to figure out how to work with the other principals in ways that aren't going to cause a lot of conflict. Countering community skepticism is a very big one. Lots of people just reported so much difficulty getting people to believe in their dream and figuring out different ways of trying to make it concrete by doing demonstrations and so on and so forth. Assembling adequate financing, that goes without saying. Clearing regulatory hurdles. A lot of cities have very, stiff, zoning requirements. For instance, arts-based projects, which is built, I think, something like 24 artist live and work buildings and studio buildings around the U.S., most of them renovations, and continues to manage them to make them affordable for artists. It has never been able to do one in Minneapolis because our zoning code will not permit people to work and live in the same space, and we still haven't got that changed. Ensuring maintenance and sustainability. So somebody mentioned this yesterday. there's such a proclivity to fund building and spaces and venues, and probably never enough thought to how are we going to sustain this, how are we going to fund the programming, and so on. And so again, in these cases also, like the theater district, I mean, what does it mean to, put 3 new theaters online in the community? How, do we need to be thinking about it ahead of time? They did a very good job of that. Avoiding displacement and gentrification, that is an issue in some places and not others. Probably the most prominent case in ours was the Hollywood Boulevard restoration in LA, which we wanted to do because we wanted to do one case which really underscored, kind of the arts capacity in an area that was historically important. But there were a lot of small organizations in this area of Hollywood Boulevard, which had kind of gotten seedy. And they were really afraid they were going to be priced out. And so the LA Economic Development Corporation that did this, were the funders of this project, worked with them to figure out how that would not happen in the process of doing that. But that's always a concern, and there are always development interests are really always looking to sort of grab onto something that somebody has already put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into, as the next sort of place that they anoint as up and coming. And there are some really good methods for dealing with that, which we could talk about in the Q&A if you want. And then finally, developing metrics for performance and evaluation. On this last point, I want to say that I never really liked the word metrics, but after we did the study and these programs got going, there were these big indicator studies that came out for both of them. And, they were, actually bid out to people to do them and everything else. And when I started seeing the metrics that they were using, I was like so appalled that I wrote a rant. And it was published first on createequity.com, which is Ian David Moss's really wonderful website about arts and culture. And it just kind of went viral. Grant makers in the arts asked if they could reproduce it in their reader, and now it's in an international journal of urban sciences. And it just takes apart an approach where somehow we're supposed to evaluate the result of a creative placemaking intervention by using metrics like whether home ownership went up in the neighborhood or whether or not people are using their cell phones on Saturday night. And I won't go into it, but I just unpack the problems with all these different indicators, and also with even the fact that how can you judge the outcome of one particular intervention place when a lot of other things are happening in the place at the same time. So it's a social science critique. And I just want to say that I personally am so distressed about this sort of tendency in the arts community as a whole to try to evaluate everything with indicators rather than to evaluate things on the basis of the reason that you funded them in the first place, which is what they say they're going to do. And I really recommend the piece, especially in either of its 2 earlier versions, because it's very accessible and makes a lot of really good points that I think will be good for anybody who's really grappling with this question of evaluation of your organizations or your activities. So that's it, and I would love to have pushback or criticisms or ideas, anything you would like to say. And here's finding my website. If you want. You want this mic? Yeah.
At another event that the Center for Arts Leadership hosted, it was a viewing party of Creative Times. Right, there was a lot of conversation about creative placemaking as an actual title for what it is that's happening. And one person said, "You're not creating a place because the places were already here." And it has kind of a connotation of being Christopher Columbus-like, that folks are going out and discovering what is already in place. And I felt that in particular when the image came up of the Native American powwow, and to me that fits more in with folk life and traditional arts, and folks getting mainstream people being exposed to things that have already been there. So I'm just wondering, as this field is growing, how it will be evolving to recognize the diversity that's already been in place, and how the NEA is kind of shaping it to address the diversity that exists culturally already, and this, I think, what problematic title of creative placemaking.
Well, thank you for that. And I've heard that from some other people too, and I really accept that. Again, it was really, their idea to have this rubric. And I would defend it in many ways because there are many places, well, here's an example. There's a lot of discussion about cultural districts in different places. And there are different kinds of cultural districts. The one people mentioned yesterday in Denver is fabulous because it includes everybody. But a lot of cultural districts, we're having this fight in Duluth, my own backyard, we're going to designate this 2-block stretch as a cultural district. And I'm totally opposed to that because I feel like that dubs every other place not a cultural district for exactly the reasons you're talking about. Creative placemaking is very kind of a loose term, but I think what we did try to do in our study was to identify places that already did have creativity, but where there was some process going on to really establishment. And I really take it as a valid criticism that I could have used some of the work I've done on Native Americans to sort of make this point that there already is a lot of creative placement. They're not asking for any money. They don't need any money to do what they're doing. So, and I do believe that every place really is a creative place or has the potential to be. And so I think it's really good to express that discomfort. And I kind of feel that way myself. That's why I'm really beginning to try to also say, we have so much creativity in so many places around us, and let's acknowledge. And I always really have loved Jane Jacobs' idea of the mosaic that she wrote about in New York City, in the 1950s, where she said, really what we have is a series of neighborhoods, and they have distinctive cultures, but they have porous boundaries. People are invited to move across the boundaries and go experience Chinatown or Little Italy or Greenwich Village. And that's the image I've been trying to put out in response to the cultural districts, phenomenon that, and I think it's really working in Duluth, that what we need is a map showing just all the varieties, including our Native American reservation and its downtown casino, where there is creative placemaking activity going on. So thank you for, yeah, sure.
Probably would change. You had said earlier you would probably change the definition now. Can you just kind of share with us how you would refine that?
Well, maybe I can go back to it. This is a long way back. I think that I would, it's both the definition and the thing on the next page. Oh, yeah, thank you. I would de-emphasize some of the more structural things, about revitalizing neighborhoods and everything else because of the, controversy around gentrification. And that's in this slide here. I think we didn't do enough to really, I'm an economist. I wrote my first piece about the economic impact of artists, but I've been totally converted by the work of Maria and a lot of other people to now believing that this is the weakest argument we can make. And I fight with my own, our own Citizens for the Art Dynamo chair all the time about this. If we go and say, it's really worth spending on the arts because every dollar you spend on us, we respend or spend some other way, this is the weakest argument you can make because scientists don't have to go in there and say, you should fund science. Or Parks and Recreation don't go in there as like, well, they do a little bit. But we should be saying what we bring is beauty, reflection, a sense of history, a place to duke out, heavy-duty conflicts, social protests. Those are the things that the arts and culture really bring. So I think I would emphasize even more the arts and culture at its core and try to de-emphasize them. I will say that Rocco Landesman was very, very insistent that we do a section in the front of our study which showed how much the arts industries, produced in terms of GNP and trade, which actually nobody had ever done before, and we did do that, and it's really big because of the entertainment industries and because of English language literature and books and magazines. I mean, it's really huge. So it's a big part of our economy, but I don't think that's the reason we should argue for it. So what's the one before this, the actual definition one? Oh, yeah, go back one slide. The next one. Yeah, there. Yeah, I think that this definition has some of the problems that you raised, that it suggests a new initiative, to strategically shape, the Native American communities around where I live, and I've written a whole study on Native artists, by the way, which I really recommend, and which explores deeply their embeddedness in their communities and the issues that they have with sharing things that are part of sacred traditions and certain kinds of materials and the services they bring, and the ways that they innovate in their communities, like how a woman musician in the reservation near me convinced the elders that women should be able to be in drum groups, which is very cool. So there's also innovation. So I would just also try to make it also acknowledge that a lot of people have, most Native American groups in Minnesota, they're trying to preserve the traditions that they do have and pass them on. And they're making new art all the time, beadwork, costuming, et cetera, but they're not necessarily trying to do some project that's a transformation of a place. Thank you very much for that.
Thanks for the talk, Ann. That was great. So I'm thinking of two things. One is from your placemaking case studies, and then from your writing in artist centers regarding the evolution of artist centers and that sort of professionalization, or that period that people go, that, beginning with the first sort of impulse and then the time of development. And then you spoke briefly about it when you talked about the theater district and everybody giving a third of their time. Can you sort of take us to some of those other findings about the time it took, like if one started today, the sort of the stories that really animate the process and the sort of things that you saw again and again?
Yeah, I think I'll go to the Artist Center study to do that mainly. Because the Artist Center study was in my backyard, and I spent a lot more time in each case, whereas the Creative Placemaking study we did by the phone, which was a little dangerous in a couple of cases, because we misidentified some of the major players, which I only learned afterwards. But so the Artist Centers, I think, are a really good example of that, because these are really clubhouses or homes. I wanted to call this study clubhouses, and some of the executive directors objected, and we actually had an inquisition at the McKnight Foundation, which was brilliantly managed by Neil Cuthbert, where we discussed this. Because I was thinking just like of the ice skating rink out where I was a kid, and like just the idea of a community place to gather and the importance of a space, but they thought it sounded like a country club. So, okay, connotation is important, so that we changed the title. These are so important, I think, because they provide a home, a dedicated space. And also, I just visited Winnipeg, where they have a women artist mentoring artists, that they have a dedicated space. They've had it for 20 years. It's made a huge difference in the success of women artists in Winnipeg, and it's very highly supported by men as well. It's just been amazingly successful. So I would say in those cases, like there were 3 or 4 of them that started in the 1970s, and maybe 1 or 2 that were really historic, like the Duluth Art Institute. But the ones that started in the 70s, they were all kind of new left things. They were young people leaving college and wondering, how can we still get together? How can we, the writer's loft? How can we make a living writing poetry? Where can we still meet? And every graduate of an art school has this problem. No access to the darkroom anymore, no access to the sculpture studio, no access to the peers, no access to the professors. And that's the most critical time when you leave schooling, when you need really mutual support. So the idea of creating, finding a dedicated space, in the Writer's Loft case, some woman who owned a bookstore gave them a space upstairs to meet, and one night one of them said, "Do you think anybody would come to an adult course for poetry, on poetry?" And people said, "Why don't you try?" So this guy said he sat there and he thought 3 people would walk in the door, and 30 people walked in the door. So this was one answer, that there's an adult. This is one of the things objections I have to the whole discussion about arts education, is that it just assumes that most adults are like a lost cause and we should focus on children. But so many adults want to learn how to make pottery or write. I took 2 creative writing courses, and they vastly improved my academic writing. So in those cases, they often started up these kind of, the American Composers Forum is another one, the Playwright Center is another one, and Intermediate Arts. Those were really the 4 started in the 70s. And fortunately for us, funders were really key in helping them get going. So we have these major foundations, McKnight, Bush, and Jerome, and they've been very, very strong supporters of individual artists and artist organizations. And their role, I think, was important, not just in, giving them some money. And it's all very modest. In our Artist Center study, we have actually show what their annual budgets are, what their membership size. Their annual budgets are not that big. One or two of them are over $1 million, but most of them are between $300,000 and $600,000. And membership is a lot of that, even though membership is a very affordable, like $35, $50, and anybody can be a member. It's not like screened or anything. I think it was really a combination of, maybe somebody giving you a space like the Writer's Loft, finding some foundation money when you first started to have an executive director and a little bit of governance structure and a little bit of marketing, figuring out how to raise money. So a lot of them, so the Loft raises a lot of its money through teaching, and it gives a lot of it back to the teaching writers, but it keeps some. The High Point Center for Printmaking, which only started in 2000, has a master printmaker, and he works with artists. They have some fellowships. When they do an opening, they keep 50% of the proceeds of what they sell at that in return for, nurturing the particular artist. So that's been a big source for them. So each of them has figured out really interesting ways of earned income as well as contributed income, and that's been a help. And then also the newer ones that started, we also have an amazing textile center started by women fiber artists, weavers, who told me that they had to go around to every church basement in Minnesota and explain to women quilters that they are fiber artists. And they built an incredible constituency and were able to build this beautiful center. They just expanded it as the best textile library in the U.S. They have fellowship programs they've been able to get our funders to have to bring really renowned textile artists in from around the world. They have, a juried, art fair. They also have, all of these places have like a membership show once a year. Everybody gets to put something in the membership show if they're a visual art form. And in that case, the Minnesota Center for Photography, which did fail, that's a story in itself. We also did two that failed. The Minnesota Dance Alliance, by the way, we did a sort of retrospective, and Film in the Cities were two organizations that failed. We did a sort of backcasting. Those were the diciest ones to do because people had disagreements. We just put the disagreements in what we did so people could see where vulnerabilities were in trying to do this process. But the other thing is that our funders, when these new ones came online, like High Point and Textile Center were both around 2000, and the Minnesota Center for Photography, they asked the executive directors of the other organizations to mentor them. And one day, kind of by accident, I ended up sitting in on one of these meetings, and I found it amazing. We had a Northern Clay Center also, which is amazing and one of the best in the country, and the woman there was a dynamo, and she was doing a wonderful job of mentoring these new executive directors who had all the questions you would have about something. And that was partly the quiet role of these arts program directors from these foundations who never took credit for it. I had to infer this, and I had to get corroboration from the other people who benefited from. They would never really say, oh yeah, that's part of my role. I think that's a way in which the larger community environment is sort of view that, we're not going to be fighting each other. We're going to help new kinds of spaces that will really nurture artists grow. Every kind of artist is overrepresented in the Twin Cities, and the most overrepresented are writers. And I think it's because the Loft has been there the longest, and it's been very, very important. And it's helped build our publishing industry, which we have a strong publishing industry. And that's another thing. I wanted to say that about Houston, by the way, too, that it's my sense, although I haven't looked at it carefully, that one of the problems for artists in Houston is that you don't have much of a commercial arts sector. So if you don't have, we have a pretty strong advertising and, publishing industry in Minnesota, and that really helps certain groups of artists. So if you have a city where you don't have, cultural industries, for-profit cultural industries, that makes it harder for artists because then they are more dependent on funding or selling their work directly and so on. I hope that helps.
One more question. Pat, do you have a question? Or no?
Well, it doesn't seem, actually I don't have a question. I had a reflection, but it is more related to Shannon's comment because it's been interesting for me to watch NEA deal with the issue of creative placemaking. When creative placemaking first sort of hit the art world as a concept, it seemed to be very loaded with this top-down sort of perspective. It was the domain of designers and architects and urban planners and people who could cook up really cool ideas and plop them down on communities that apparently didn't have places. But as a folklorist, one of the things I'm really aware of is what makes a place is its community. And I've been very interested to watch NEA's take on creative placemaking. And when I actually watched the webinar that they put out last year in relationship to the grant program, the webinar was made up of individuals who had sat on the panel, and they really so very specifically spoke to the fact that what they wanted to see in proposals were strong representations of the place itself as part of the artistic programming. And it really had moved, the definition of creative placemaking, it seemed to me, had really moved from the top-down approach to really the arts as an animator of community, and communities as the life behind all artistic activity. So just, it was a comment.
Well, I didn't watch the webinar, so I'm so thrilled to hear you say that. And I will give you just a little genealogy that actually when we were hired, because the NEA couldn't really actually fund us directly, we were funded by the Mayor's Institute for Community Design, which was an NEA program that had been created 10 or 15 years before with partnership with the American Architectural Association, and it's exactly what you think. It was sending designers out to tell cities, you know, how to spruce themselves up. And the NEA would give them little bits of money. So really, this was a radical transformation. And I think you have to also really, or I need to acknowledge that Joan Shigekawa had funded a lot of the more interesting the research on communities and community work at Rockefeller, you know, than almost any other funder in the US. So that was all kind of part of the beginning of this. And I think it is really true that under her stewardship, you know, the vision of the whole Our Town thing changed a lot. And I'm really thrilled to hear that. Because I think that is really right. And the whole idea that that you needed an architect or a designer or something to do this is sort of like faded away. And the whole MICD thing is gone, so.
It's really true. And, you know, it's the only webinar I've ever watched in my entire life.
Wow.
It was life-changing.
Ah, great. I have to go watch it.
So Pat Jasper and Carol Parrott-Blue, who was one of our speakers earlier today, yesterday, actually both are grantees from the NEA Art Town Grant. Pat Jasper with Houston Arts Alliance and the Folklife Fund. And so it is, I think, representative of there are ideas and actions of creative placemaking that are happening, and we're looking forward to seeing how those evolve over the course of the time and what are the effects of that over time. And thank you so much. So we have still some food, actually quite a lot of food, but we're going to take just a minute in order to stand up, move. I encourage you to come back closer to the front of the room. And then for our next panel.